There we go. All right, so welcome officially. So we are here today to talk about how to advocate for LGBTQIA plus survivors. Okay. I know this is a huge topic. Oftentimes it's a heavy topic, right? Especially in the kind of environment that we're living in now, right? We're seeing a lot of backlash against the community. And we're seeing folks continue to have barriers to receiving services. And as folks who work with victims, work with survivors, work with other, victims of crime, what we want to do is provide equitable access. We want to provide trauma-informed access and care, right? And sometimes that can be difficult when so many things are coming at us, not just our regular everyday stressors of working in nonprofits, of funding and different laws changing and, all these things. The loss of employees, right? I know that's a big one. Turnover is huge, right? But then we have all of these things coming at us from outside forces, right? And some of the technical assistance, requests and things that we've gotten here at the coalition are surrounding this intense pushback on folks who are providing, healthy relationships curriculum, folks who are even just supporting and allies of LGBTQIA plus survivors. And so hopefully today we can break down some of these basic concepts and talk about ways that we can come together and really advocate for people within our community, right? Remember that when we support, boost up, and create access for the most marginalized members of our community, we increase access and lower barriers for everyone, right? And that's what we want to do, right? We want to make it so people can receive services. We want to make it so when people come to us, they are not getting re-victimized, right? We want to make it so that people are not afraid of what could happen in our organizations, right? And so I know I've dedicated my my life to changing the landscape and really creating access for folks. And I hope that you'll join me in that, right? So here's our fun grant slide. So we're funded by OVW and the Utah Office of Victims of Crime. So we'll shout out to that. Thank you for letting me have a job. I do enjoy having a job and buying food and having a place to live. I enjoy that. So here are some of our objectives, okay? And you're going to notice, you're going to be like, gosh, those are some pretty simple objectives, right? But honey, just wait. We're going to break it down. We're going to talk about a lot of things today, right? If you've ever been in a webinar or training with me, you know that we're going to make a lot of connections here. We're going to have some really great conversations because remember, all these things that we're intersecting with, we're interacting with, are all connected, right? So we may think that, one thing doesn't feed another thing or doesn't lead to another thing, but they all are interconnected, right? And we have to look at things at a holistic level, right? We have to look at it in a way that we're meeting the needs and meeting people where they're at, right? So this first one, we're going to delve into barriers for underserved survivors. And you're going to notice, one of the biggest things you're going to notice is that many of the barriers that Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA plus folks experience, other marginalized groups also experience. You're going to notice some huge connections with undocumented survivors, survivors from plural communities, plural families, and Native survivors. Those are usually the big ones that people make those connections with, right? Remember that when someone is marginalized, when someone has been devalued in a community, culture, society, that devalued, that marginalized identity is going to be used to victimize them, right? That's going to be used, that in many ways can be considered a vulnerability, right? So remember that our most vulnerable folks are the ones that are most at risk to being victimized. So the next one, we're gonna, better understand best practices for working with underserved survivors. Okay, and you're gonna notice, a lot of these things are gonna be these basic tenets of trauma-informed care. And what does that look like for queer people? What does that look like for trans people, right? We're also going to explore language. We're not going to go too deep into this, right? Because there are so many resources online to look up language. But we're gonna talk about why it's important and why sometimes it can be meaningless, right? Because we all have our own experiences. So let's get into it, okay? Remember, if you have any questions, go ahead and pop those right into chat, okay? Because there's a lot of things that are going to come up. And if you have a question, chances are someone else also has that question, right? So ask away. I am the person to ask questions to. It doesn't matter really how you word it, right? I'm here to support you. I'm here to help you out. Okay. So we can figure it out together. All right. So let's start with some of the basics. Let's start with some of these building blocks, we'll call them, so that we're all on the same page with some of the language that we're using throughout this presentation. So I'm sure maybe you've been a little bit confused, or maybe someone you know has been a little bit confused about the differences between gender and sex, right? There, some folks are like, wait, aren't those the same thing, right? They are not. They are not. So gender is this social aspect of sex, right? This is the social construction of. Okay, so there's many things that kind of go into gender. We have things like gender expression, the way that you do gender. For some of us who have taken a gender studies class or a women's studies class, we've probably heard, to do gender, right? Maybe we've heard that gender is performative, right? Because we learn that we are socialized in our gender, right? So that's the social aspect of it, right? And then we have sex assigned at birth, right? So sex assigned at birth. So think back maybe to when you were born, when you were born. How do doctors sex us as children, right? How do they determine our sex? They look at our physical genitals, they look at our physical body, right? And if we meet the standard for what is considered male, then we get an M on our birth certificate. If we don't meet that standard, then we get an F on our birth certificate, right? Saying that we're not male, so we must be female, right? We have to be one or the other. Now that leaves out folks who are intersex, right? There are some states and a growing number of countries who do have a designated third identifier for folks who are intersex, right? About 2 to 3% of the population, statistically speaking, is intersex. That's a lot of people. That is a lot of people, right? Even at like Weber State University in Ogden, that's several thousand people, right? Several thousand students who are intersex, right? So there are over 250 different ways to be intersex, right? We know, with especially the more research that we do on the human condition, that we find out that sex is more complicated than just male and female, right? There are so many different variations of human sex in the way that it's expressed through genes, through through physical, traits and stuff like that. And so that's why when you hear these arguments, especially against trans folks, that people say, oh, it's just basic biology. It's like, honey, dear, you're wrong. Nope, that's not how it works, silly goose. That's not how it works, silly goose, right? Intersex people exist, right? And especially, I hear a lot of these arguments that are like, oh, well, if your chromosomes are XX, then you're a woman. If your chromosomes are XY, then you're a man. And it's like, well, you might be surprised, my friend. You might be surprised, right? Because there are many, different ways of being intersex that, folks may have a genetic expression that differs from their physical expression, right? So, for example, androgen insensitivity syndrome, right, where folks have XY chromosomes and yet they are physically what would be considered physically female, right? And so, how does that person determine someone's sex, right? And so it's much more complicated than we think and that we understand. And remember, especially when we go through this presentation, that just because you haven't experienced something, just because you haven't heard of something, does not mean that it doesn't exist, right? A perfect example is, I don't know how many of you have heard of a coelacanth. It's an ancient bony fish that we thought was extinct millions of years ago. It turns out that those little gooses are hanging out off the coast of Madagascar, just living their best life, hundreds of meters below the surface. But if I've never seen a coelacanth in Utah, in Pineview or the Great Salt Lake, it doesn't mean that they don't exist, right? I just haven't seen one, right? And so keep that in mind. Like, just because you're not transgender, just because you're, not, gay, bisexual, doesn't mean that folks don't exist, right? And it's okay to learn about new things and have your opinions and your, change and your world view kind of open up. That's part of being adult. That's part of being human, right? So the next thing is gender identity, right? So this is someone's sense of maleness, femaleness, multiple genders, or no gender, right? So pop quiz, type into chat. How many of us, who here has a gender identity? What do you think? You can also raise your hand if you'd like. So who here has a gender identity? Pop that in the chat. Do you think you do? So folks, look at that. Look at that. I love this. So I'm seeing everyone has one. Me, everyone. I love that. Excellent. Great. And that, yep, you did great. You passed the test, right? Everyone has a sense of maleness, femaleness, multiple genders, or no gender, right? And it's often assumed that only transgender people have gender identity, but guess what? Everyone has a gender identity, right? I bestow upon you the gift of gender identity. Yeah, it's really interesting because that's something that's really common, is that the folks from, these like quote unquote normative identities, right? That they are seen as not having identity, right? So cisgender folks are seen as not having gender identity. Heterosexual folks are seen as not having a sexual orientation. Men are seen as not having gender, right? So it's white people are seen as not having race, right? It's so interesting, but we know that's not true. White people do have race. Heterosexual people do have sexual orientation. Cisgender people do have a gender identity. So yeah, hopefully this is helpful to kind of break apart some of these things, because it can be confusing, right? Because there's so many different terms and not all of us have taken, sociology and gender classes. So next is sexual orientation, right? So this is who, maybe who you want to smooch, right? Who you want to smooch, who you want to have consensual sex with, right? Or who you don't want to smooch, or who you don't want to have consensual sex with. So there are a number of different sexual orientations, all of which are valid, right? We have, gay, bisexual, heterosexual, pansexual, demisexual. And remember that the human experience is vast, right? we have a lot of commonalities. We have a lot of similar experiences that we share. But the ways that we experience our own identities, our own sexuality, our own gender are going to be different than other people, right? Like, especially my best friend, we're both gay. But he experiences his identity, his queerness different than I do, right? And not just in the people and the gender of folks that we're attracted to, but in the ways that even culturally, right? He's Native, and so identifying as two-spirit is something very different than my experience of my sexual orientation and gender identity, right? Um, so next is or actually let's delve into this a little bit more. So one of the things, kind of the pushback or questions that I oftentimes get when we talk about sexual orientation is folks will say, well, what about asexuality, right? How can that be a sexual orientation if someone doesn't experience sexual attraction? So first off, asexuality is on a spectrum, right? And one of the things about sexual orientation, it tells us who we are and are not attracted to, right? And so asexuality is absolutely valid, right? And it's absolutely a sexual orientation. So again, keep that in mind, right? Is we may not have experienced this, or we may not specifically know someone personally who has, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? So romantic orientation, so it's, who you love, right? So some people are like, okay, well, why are we, breaking it up between sexual orientation and romantic orientation, right? Well, I mean, think back maybe in your dating years or, maybe, hanging out with people that maybe you were maybe sexually attracted to a dating partner or a friend or something, right? But you weren't romantically attracted to them. You're like, yeah, you're very attractive and your personality definitely not meshing with it. Definitely not my thing, right? Or maybe you have a friend that you're romantically attracted to, but there's just not that sexual attraction element, or even a partner, right? So yeah, think about that, right? Especially like when you talk about celebrity crushes, right? I think this is an example that kind of helps break it down. Is so real talk. My like celebrity crush, who has been my celebrity crush since I was a kid, gosh, is Elizabeth Mitchell. It is what it is, right? And hey, do I like to watch her in Lost or, other movies and stuff? For sure. Definitely a cutie, for sure. Do I want to tell her about my childhood trauma and share a bank account with her? Sure don't. Sure don't. So, um, hopefully that kind of helps you break it down. But there is a pretty big difference. And think about too in your life, and even when you're thinking about past relationships and when people are talking about theirs, is how you can kind of differentiate between those different things, right? Okay, so we have a little video that we're going to watch. And so I'm going to pause the recording and I'm going to switch my screen really quick. So type into chat, what were some takeaways? What came to mind? What stood out to you about that video? I'm going to pop the link into chat as well, so you have access to that. What stood out to you? What was new for you? That's usually a pretty big one that people, comments people have. Everyone's an expert on that? There was nothing new in that video that you'd seen? Well, look at us. Look at us. Maybe that video did an excellent job explaining it, right? I think my favorite part of that video is the ways that they use visual representations with especially shapes. that when you combine a circle and a square, or a square and a triangle, that you get a completely different shape, right? And when you have, slots that fit these shapes that we're, used to, the quote unquote standard, is that those other shapes don't fit and can't get through, right? And so how do we in our organizations ensure that folks who don't fit this quote unquote standard of what it means to be a victim, what it means to be a survivor, that they are getting services and support that they need. Ooh, someone said that some policies may overlook people who are more than one identity, like a Black woman. Yeah. So being Black and being a woman, right? And how those identities on their own, create different barriers, but when they're combined, create new barriers, right? Absolutely. Yeah. So hopefully that was helpful. I love that video. I think it does a really great job. And I linked it in the chat for everyone to grab. So, so now let's talk a little bit about barriers. Okay. We have talked, about barriers a little bit so far, but let's get really into these detailed descriptions, right? So we're going to start with some nuances, right? So nuances are these slight differences in things that we generally know, right? So think about like relationships and attraction, right? So we generally know how relationships and attraction work, but then when we see something that maybe is a little bit different than what we're used to, that we may feel like we don't understand or have a hard time kind of grasping things. And those are those nuances, right? There's those subtle differences, right? So the first one we're going to talk about is MSM versus gay. So MSM stands for men who have sex with men. I'm sure you've heard of this, especially when there's like a health department study or survey that goes out. In their, results, they will have generally will break down respondents, identities as gay or, men who have sex with men, among other things, right? And the reason for this is so men who have sex with men can be, people who have a number of different identities, right? It could be heterosexual men who are married, have been married, or have had relationships with women who have consensual sex with other men, right? They don't identify as gay, they don't identify as bisexual, they identify as heterosexual, but they are having consensual sex with other men, right? There's a number of reasons why folks do this or identify in or don't identify with, being gay, bisexual, pansexual, and so on and so forth. It could be, discrimination within their community, culture, society. It could be fear, right? Especially of things like hate crimes, being rejected, losing their job, losing their housing, losing family, friends. It could be internalized homophobia, right? There's just a number of different reasons why this could happen, and maybe this person simply just doesn't want to use the identifying terms as, gay, pansexual, bisexual, so on and so forth. But especially in your advocacy when you're working with folks, it's really important not to assume that if someone discloses or talks about having consensual relations with someone of the same gender, that we're not assuming that they're gay, right? We're not just going right to that, is that we're listening to them. Because if you're working with someone and they do admit that they've had, consensual sexual relations with someone of the same gender, and they, don't identify as gay, and you say you offer like, oh, here's some services for the Pride Center, or here's some services specifically for gay men, that could just shut them down instantly, right? That they could just disengage from advocacy, they could stop showing up. I know that this is something that does come up, especially when, like, I've done tabling events. You know, at a number of different events, but the one that pops up the most for me is when I did a tabling event several years ago at, I think it's FanX, the convention that's here in Utah. And you know, we actually had a number of men come up to the table, and you know, they would be like, oh, you know, I'm looking for my sister or for my friend or whatever. And some of the stories that they would tell, it was pretty clear that they were speaking from experience, and not really knowing how to communicate that, or if it was a safe thing to talk about. And it, like, yeah, that was a huge example. So we didn't, you know, say, okay, well, here's, you know, here's some information on being gay and a survivor. It was listening to that person and you know, providing them, you know, general resources and general feedback and anything specific that they asked for. And it went surprisingly well. So that, yeah, I think that's a perfect example. So different models of homosexuality. So models of homosexuality is an academic, you know, term. It's research, right? Is essentially the different ways that communities, cultures, and societies view homosexuality. So for example, here in the greater United States, homosexuality is generally defined as, so we'll use the example of like men who have sex with men, is, you know, if, you know, two men are engaging in, you know, a sexual relationship, that both men, regardless of their position in the act, is considered gay. And in other places, depending on, you know, cultural standards, especially surrounding masculinity, that men who are more submissive, men who, you know, bottom or are the receiver, are considered gay or homosexual because they're in that submissive, more, you know, quote unquote feminine role. And then men who are the aggressors, who are, you know, the tops, who are the penetrators, that they are considered still heterosexual, still, right? Because they are adhering to the standards of masculinity. So they have not defied those. And so that they would still be considered heterosexual. So if you see how the models of homosexuality and how, you know, men who have sex with men, how those things can interact, and especially culturally, how those things really kind of feed each other, right? Yeah, so keep that in mind, because if someone comes in, especially if they were sexually assaulted, and they, you know, share with you that they have been sexually assaulted, that they may, you know, question their sexuality, but, you know, if they disclose that they have had, you know, sexual relationships with men, or maybe have not, that the ways that they are viewing their situation might be drastically different than the way that you're viewing the situation. So keep that in mind, that the victim or survivor that you're working with may see their assault, their situation drastically different than the way that you see it. And you don't want to impose your beliefs and your definitions upon them, because then that creates a huge disconnect and just a misunderstanding and a miscommunication. So going into displays of affection. So again, you know, remember that different cultures have different standards of masculinity and different standards of femininity, and what people can and can't do in friendship relationships, and platonic relationships, and romantic relationships. You know, there's punishments and rewards. So, you know, depending on where that survivor victim is from, that they may have more intimate and close physical interactions with people that they're close with, because that is seen in their culture as just, you know, common, is just kind of the normal thing to do, right? So for example, men kissing each other on the cheek when they say hello, maybe holding hands in public. So if you're working with a victim or survivor and they someone drops them off at your organization and maybe they hold hands for a minute or they kiss cheeks or they hug for a long time, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's that person's partner. That could just be a really close, trusted friend. Remember that intimacy is defined by emotional closeness. And so that interaction could simply just be that close physical contact that person needs, because they're going through such a hard time. So yeah, we don't want to assume. Right? Maybe if someone's like, full on making out with someone in a car, that maybe might be a little bit different, but just, keep in mind that there may be differences in culture, right? Especially surrounding affection. Punishment for homosexuality. So different cultures and community, punishment for homosexuality can be drastically different. I mean, like I said, I grew up in Davis County, Utah, and I grew up as specifically a Davis County Mormon, right? I was never LDS. I was never a Latter-day Saint. We were always Mormon. It was during the time when the church paid millions and millions of dollars to revamp and take back that word. I don't know if you remember that ad campaign, but culturally, we were Mormon. That's what our culture was, right? And it was really interesting because I knew that me talking to anyone about my feelings, my identity, kind of, the things that I was thinking about, worried about, struggling with, I knew that if I said anything that I would be rejected. I would be rejected from my social group. I would be rejected from my community. I would probably, be rejected from my family, because that's what I saw, right? That's what I saw. That's what was communicated with me. And that was scary. So I avoided talking about that, right? I mean, people knew, but I knew the punishment for that was something that I didn't want to deal with, right? And so depending on different communities, right, that can be different, right? It could be rejection. Some communities, cultures, and countries, the punishment for homosexuality is death. Okay, so if you are working with someone and they're really nervous to talk about their identity, they're really nervous to talk about maybe an assault or what's happened to them, it could be because what they know is that there's severe punishment for their identity, right? Or that depending on where they're from, that even if they were assaulted and it was an unconsensual experience, that they will still be seen as homosexual and then they will still face the consequences, right? So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind, is that, I mean, I'm a millennial, I do this work, I have, gay stickers all over my car now, but I grew up in the 80s and 90s. I grew up through the AIDS crisis. I grew up through these times where things were very different than they were today. So the ways that I still am a little bit nervous about that is because of how of my lived experience. So keep that in mind, okay? And everyone's experience is going to be different. And sometimes we just don't know the details, right? So dishonor can be a major one as well. And again, we're looking through this cultural lens and this experience of the lived experience of the victim or survivor, is that we may not know exactly what the assault or their identity means culturally, and that might create some additional barriers. And then trauma, right? Unfortunately, those who are the most marginalized in communities, cultures, and society are the ones that oftentimes face the biggest burden of trauma, right? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about common barriers. So the top one, of course, really ties into the stuff that we were just talking about. The fear of being outed, right? What if someone finds out that I am gay? What if someone finds out that I am bisexual? What if someone finds out that I have had same gender experiences? Is that going to cost me my job? Is that going to cost me my housing? Is that going to cost me my support system? And that's scary. That is really scary. I mean, yes, it's 2023. Um, think about some of the headlines. Think about some of the things that you're hearing from your neighbors, your family, your friends, from the news. Is these anti-LGBTQ IA plus laws, these calls to action. We're going to talk about the grooming myth here in just a second, but all these terrible negative things that you're hearing, like that's going to affect people, right? Um, I know even for me that I kind of, went back in the closet a couple years ago because it just simply wasn't safe. Like my job was to travel around the state of Utah to train people on how to work with my community. And I had to go back, in the closet and be really, really careful about the stories I shared, about the ways that I said things because it was so dangerous, right? Being followed into the bathroom, people yelling things like that is really scary. And especially like I was doing my job alone and I was in these rural communities alone. I was driving alone. And so that was really scary. Having to have my employer create safety plans with me every single time I left to do my job. The amount of times I had to check in, the amount of times that I had to send pictures of where I last was, of sharing my location, of, if I didn't check in every 2 hours, I had a supervisor who would call me and say, "Hey, are you okay? What's going on?" Telling what room I checked in, when I was leaving, when I got home. Like this is what I had to do because it's been so dangerous, right? Um, and just like imagine what people have to lose, right? Um, it's really scary, and especially if you're a victim of crime and you're struggling with things like PTSD, if you're struggling, with the effects of being assaulted, that intensity and fear just, oh gosh, it's just so much. So think about hate and bias. This is the sad reality. This is the sad reality. Is every time we work with someone who's two-spirit or LGBTQIA plus who has been assaulted, who has experienced sexual violence, that we have to take into account that this was hate motivated or bias based. We have to, because sexual violence is a tool used to control other people, and especially a tool used to control those who are the most vulnerable and marginalized, right? We already know that transgender women, especially transgender women of color, are most at risk to be murdered, right? The vast majority, more than 50% of transgender and gender nonconforming folks have experienced sexual violence in their lifetime. That's too much, right? Oh, it's a lot. It's a lot. And think about how when people share their experience that, oftentimes folks will minimize it and say, oh, that wasn't sexual assault. They just didn't know that you were trans. So they were nervous, they were worried. No, no. I just shared with you that I was raped. I was raped. This isn't a misunderstanding, right? And so especially when you're working with victims and survivors, keep that in mind. Think about, am I asking these questions because of my curiosity? Am I defending someone who has perpetrated violence? Am I invalidating a victim? And if I am, why? Think about it. Why? Okay. A lot of these moments that we have in our lives are learning moments, right? I know that when I do presentations and I have interactions with people and, this might be because I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, but when I'm thinking about, what happened or how things went, I will think about that. I'll think about, oh, this didn't go as planned. Maybe I can try this differently next time. Or, I don't know if that was the right way to say that, and change it. So be, introspective. Think about kind of the things that we do and the things that we say, and how can we do better next time, right? We can't change the past, but what we can do is plan and change and work towards a better future. Okay. So that has this fourth dot point down, having to educate service providers. So think about, especially I hear this from transgender and non-binary victims and survivors, is that service providers simply don't know how to provide services for folks, right? And the thing is that you absolutely do, right? Remember to adhere to those trauma-informed care tenets, right? Those pillars of trauma-informed care that were strength-based, right? We're boosting up and pointing out those strengths in that victim or survivor. We're meeting that person where they're at, right? Not where we want them to be, right? We're meeting them where they are at, not where we want them to be, right? That's hard. That's hard. We take a lot of ownership in our jobs and supporting people, right? Provide appropriate resources, right? Provide validation to folks, right? Think about the last time someone told you, thank you for sharing that. That sounds like that was really hard to talk about. When did someone last thank you for sharing something difficult? Think about how that feels, right? Validation is a huge, huge thing in humans. We need that. We're emotional creatures, right? We're emotional animals. We are social beings and we need the interactions with other people. So let's talk a little bit about the grooming myth, and then we're gonna have a discussion. We're gonna break this down. We're gonna talk about it. So how many of you have heard of this grooming myth where folks who are in positions of power, you see it on social media, stuff like that, where people are co-opting language from the anti-sexual violence movement to harm people, especially people who are Two-Spirit LGBTQIA. How many of you have heard of that? You can raise your hand or type into chat. Yes or no? How many of you have seen it in your daily lives? Whether it be personally at your organization, whether it be, on the news, on social media, from friends or family, maybe from colleagues, right? Okay, yep, we're getting folks popping into chat that they have, right? So this is really, really harmful. This is really, really harmful. So essentially folks are co-opted, they're using this word, especially this word grooming, right? They're using this word inappropriately, right? They're using it in a way that it just doesn't make sense, right? Because what people are doing is not grooming, right? Generally, what people are saying is grooming is when, and this is wrong, this is incorrect, is like drag queens being around people, being around children, that queer people just literally being in the same space with children, young people. It's kind of bled into just Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA plus people in general. It's also now included people who are allies of Two-Spirit and LGBTQIA plus people. The biggest thing that I've seen recently is this pushback on organizations who are providing healthy relationships curriculum, consent curriculum, so on and so forth in schools, and other groups throughout the state, is that all of these people are getting lumped into this group and being called groomers, right? So this word is being used to create a moral panic, right? And if you don't know what a moral panic is essentially when usually folks in power, claim that there's something terrible happening specifically to children, but there's no actual evidence or anything to back that up, right? So it's a very, very effective tool. Remember back in the 70s and the 80s when this myth was, oh, yep, I'm going to get to that satanic panic here in a second, where gay men were seen as dangerous and that they can't be around children, right? We saw in the 80s the satanic panic, right? Especially in relationship to Dungeons and Dragons, right? And it's wild because now with research about Dungeons and Dragons and tabletop role-playing games like that, they're actually quite beneficial for children, right? Because kids, young folks are able to practice perspective taking. They're able to talk about hard things. They're able to problem solve and work with other people. So actually Dungeons and Dragons is actually quite beneficial for kids, right? It doesn't turn them into, cultists or anything. It's actually quite good, right? And those of us who do play Dungeons and Dragons, we're really creative, right? Yeah, I mean, think about in the 90s, there was a resurgence of the satanic panic, right? Remember X-Files did an episode on it, and Scully is like, there's no evidence, there's no ritual sacrifice, it's not happening, right? Because that's essentially what a moral panic is. It's this panic based off of nothing, right? This panic based off of something that could potentially happen, right? We saw it with the anti-trans bathroom laws, right? We saw that with the anti-trans bathroom panic. Real talk, all of you have been in a public restroom with a trans person, you just didn't know. Because why would you know? Right? Why would you know? People are just going to the bathroom doing the thing. I mean, this is a regurgitated argument that has been used over and over and over throughout the years, and it just has a different shirt on, right? But it's the exact same thing. So again, these are not based on reality. I mean, another example would be, remember the clown panic, I don't know, like 8 years ago, where there was all these YouTube videos that would pop up, with this quote unquote footage of clowns at people's doorsteps or emerging from the woods. There's no actual evidence that happened. Anyone can dress up in a clown costume and go to their friend's door and push their little video cam door button, and their friend record it, and then they post it on YouTube, right? So I really want you to engage your critical thinking skills. If it sounds off, if it goes against, everything that you've already known, maybe you should question it a little bit, right? If there's never been an issue with, queer folks just existing, there probably still isn't, okay? And remember, like, these are all battles that we've fought and decided, right? Queer people, trans people, we're still going to continue to get rights. We're not going to go back in time. We're not going to go back in history, right? We are pushing forward, right? People can try, but we're not going to let it happen, right? So this is really misleading, right? I'm going to pop actually a quote, or excuse me, a link into chat. So this is a really, really great resource It's by Prevent Connect, and they have a podcast. And then they also have a couple articles and resources on there. But one of them includes the National Consensus Statement of Anti-Sexual Assault and Domestic Violence Organizations in support of full and equal access for the transgender community. And it talks about the myth of transgender people being a danger to kids, women and children in bathrooms. So yeah, it's wild because we're literally seeing this and it's literally affecting us. So here is an actual definition of grooming, right? So see how it's completely different. See how it's completely different. So grooming is a tactic commonly used to abuse children in which someone why can't I say that word right now? Builds a trusting relationship with a child, their family, and community to manipulate, coerce, and force the child to engage in sexual activities. The person grooming identifies vulnerabilities, erodes the child's boundaries, and builds up to acts of sexual abuse and control while convincing the world around the child that they are safe in their care. Okay, so two very, very different things, right? So a preventionist at a sexual assault organization going into a high school to teach about consent and healthy relationships, is that grooming? No, very clearly is not grooming. It's a complete opposite, right? It is giving folks tools and resources to prevent things like this, right? To prevent grooming, to prevent sexual violence. So let's talk about it. I want to hear from you. So of all the things that we've already talked about, all the things that we've already discussed, how can you personally, how can you and your organizations, how can you combat anti-LGBTQIA rhetoric? What can you do? Type into chat what you can do. What are things policy-wise that you can do? What are things community level you can do? What are things on a personal one-on-one level you can do? What are things maybe within programming that you can do? All right, let's see what we got here. Let's see what we got here. Scroll up real quick. Ooh, someone said participate in Pride events. Yeah, why would participating in Pride events be beneficial for this? Well, think about it, right? Is that you are connecting with the community, not only providing resources, but also support, right? Going to Pride events, oftentimes they have education experiences, they have resources and information that can keep you up to date on what is happening, right? Especially these different organizations who are fighting back, right? There are a number of even organizations in Utah that are doing a lot of, really great work in, creating access, right? And sometimes we just don't know. Okay, so someone else said, continuing to educate ourselves, right? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, think about, especially these like webinars, we do, these conversations that we have. How have these changed the way that you see the world, changed the way that your advocacy, that your practice works, right? Do you ask people their pronouns now? Do you stop and think before you ask a question? It's like, hey, is this curiosity or is this helping this victim or survivor, right? And also just understanding these basic cultural differences and nuances can be really beneficial, right? Like I recently added that slide about nuances, and especially the men who have sex with men, versus men who identify as gay, like those are two different things. And a lot of times folks are like, oh, I had no idea, right? Educating them on why they are being harmful. So yeah, having education moments, right? So, if you've been with me before and we've, been in different presentations and stuff, especially live ones, one of the things I love, love, love doing is gentle corrections, right? When folks say something that is potentially problematic or harmful or, directed, is that we have a little learning moment that, you can say, oh, that's actually a really great example of homophobia, or, you know, think about how this may affect survivors. Like there's all these different ways that we can create, turn that into an educational moment, right? And I love that. Call out microaggressions and misconceptions. Yeah. So that again, that that educating moment, right? Where we're saying, oh, did you, know that dot dot dot, right? Or I also want to point out too that it's important too that we that when we're, I guess I don't know if you've heard the term calling out versus calling in, and how can we use these educational moments to not only help guide or support someone in, correct information, but also, even like change their perspective, or have them, really take a look at themselves, right? Someone said, be an ally, educate yourself and the people you work with, shut down bigoted talk and actions when you do come across them. Yeah, so that's really big, right? Because there's sociological phenomena that when there are no sanctions or interventions on bad behavior, that folks oftentimes see it as being accepted, right? So if someone doesn't say something, then that person is not getting those social sanctions or formal sanctions that are telling them that, hey, that behavior is not welcome here. And then they continue to do it because there's no pushback, there's no punishment, there's no sanctions, right? It goes hand in hand with silence does not equal consent, right? Hopefully that helps you make those connections there. Someone said not have gender restrictions on our groups or other events. Yeah, so there's a lot of things that don't need gender restrictions, right? If you have like a group for male survivors, that makes sense. That is for male survivors, right? Having that shared experience, coming together and talking with other folks, with same identities about their abuse and their experiences and how, maybe masculinity has affected that. That can be incredibly beneficial and healing, right? But do we need to gender segregate a training? Do we need to, do all these other things that we're doing that really just add more work to us, right? Even in our housing, right? How are we housing victims and survivors, right? So thank you, everyone. Those are great. And keep in mind that it can be challenging, right? It can be challenging because it can be difficult to hear about a group, a community that has been so, greatly discriminated against. And it can be really hard to hear about that. And it's really important that we stand up, support marginalized groups, right? Because it's not just one person, it's not just UCASA, who's going to end sexual violence, it's all of us. And it's especially when, marginalized folks, when we're fighting for our rights and our literal basic ability to live, right? Is that we need allies, we need support from other folks, right? Is that we can yell and yell and yell over and over ad nauseum, right? But it's really when our allies, especially our heterosexual and cisgender allies, come to bat with us and support us and help us, right? Because sometimes people stop listening to vulnerable and marginalized folks. Oftentimes they do. So we need that support. We need everyone to stand with us to change the world. Okay, so we're doing great. We're doing great here. So the next 4 slides, we're going to talk about what I call the big 4. So heteronormativity, cisnormativity, homophobia / biphobia, and transphobia. So these are big ones. We're going to break down the definition of, and then we're going to talk about ways that we see this in advocacy, right? In supporting survivors. So the first one is heteronormativity. Okay. So this is the idea, the belief that everyone is heterosexual and that those who are not heterosexual, they're considered, less than or inferior. So can you give me an example of where you've seen this come into play in your life? Where have you seen, just based on that definition, how have you seen the belief that everyone is heterosexual and that those who are not are less than or inferior? Where do you see that? Think about the media. It's a really good place, like sitcoms. What about in advocacy, right? When you're working with victims, when you're working with survivors, right? Think of how you've seen that, right? So someone said marketing. Oh, someone said t-shirts for young children. Oh, most movies and TV shows highlight heterosexual relationships. The nuclear family. Oh, yeah. Oh, honey. Nuclear family. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, like that's a great example. Like the standard of family is, a husband and wife, white picket fence, 2.5 kids, right? Yeah, TV shows and movies. Think about how many TV shows and movies even have queer or trans characters. Think about how many TV shows that have relationships with two-spirit LGBTQIA plus folks, right? There was a study that was recently done of the film industry and the incredible lack of representation of marginalized identities. And we're not surprised, right? And it's wild. It's unfortunate, right? Is that there's just simply little to no representation, right? So yeah, excellent. Y'all are doing great. So yeah, I mean, marriage was one thing, right? Traditional marriage, all those conversations and debates and that being disallowed, that's a huge one. So let's talk a little bit about this picture. I absolutely love this picture. I think it does such a great job in explaining heteronormativity. So it's a picture of a fork and a knife, and they're asking a pair of chopsticks. So which one of you is the fork? So this is generally referring to when someone asks. So in my experience, when someone asks, maybe 2 gals that are holding hands or in a relationship saying like, so which one of you is the man? Well, fun fact, the whole point of a lesbian relationship is that there's no man, but I digress. But what they're essentially asking without having the language, resources, or information is that, hey, I recognize your relationship as a relationship. It's similar enough to mine to where I can see that, but it's different enough to where I don't understand how you navigate gender norms and gender roles without them already being pre-assigned to you. So in my relationship, I know what to do, how to do it, how to behave, how to act without being told. So how do you determine roles within your relationship? Because they're not assigned. And again, fun fact, we just like have a conversation with each other. So I like walk up to my partner and say, hey girl. I really hate doing dishes, but I love doing laundry. Like, give me the laundry any day. Like, let me fold every shirt, right? And she's like, sure, dishes are fine. I like, watching my crafting videos while I do dishes. And I'm like, perfect. I'm gonna cuddle with the cat while I do laundry. Great. We had that conversation. We figured out how to do that, right? I like to mess with electronics. So heck yeah, I want to play with the car when it's busted and I want to fix all that stuff, right? But I don't like, other things, right? So yeah, we just have conversations. So, I mean, LGBTQIA plus relationships are more egalitarian, right? There are more conversations had in those relationships because we are allowed, we get kind of that privilege, right? Is to be able to talk to each other and decide kind of how we want our relationship to be. So that's kind of, that's kind of cool, but also, we don't get to kind of fall back on those traditional gender roles and gender norms, right? So how you're going to see heteronormativity affect your advocacy, or how you're going to see it in advocacy, is like gay, bisexual folks are questioned about their relationship with those who has perpetrated them. So, folks focusing on the relationship as opposed to the assault or abuse, right? Or denying that it even happened. We do see that folks will blame the person's identity rather than the person who is perpetrated, right? Because they have defied normative gender roles and identities for relationships and attraction. And so they are receiving those social sanctions, right? So cisnormativity is very similar, but it has to do with gender identity. So the assumption that everyone is cisgender and that those who are not are less than and inferior. So let's break down the term cisgender for a sec. So cis, CIS, means same or same side as. So this generally describes someone whose gender identity, someone's sense of maleness, femaleness, multiple genders, or no gender, is congruent with or quote unquote matches their sex assigned at birth. So majority of folks probably here would identify as cisgender. You may not have heard that term because it is a relatively new term. It was coined in like the mid 90s, but yeah, it just describes someone whose gender identity is congruent with or matches their sex assigned at birth. Similar to how transgender describes someone whose gender identity is incongruent with or does not match someone's sex assigned at birth, right? I think for a couple of months ago, there was, was it Twitter, that they made a rule saying that cisgender was a slur on the platform, which is really interesting. It for sure is not a slur. It's really interesting to see kind of how they're weaponizing that language when it is simply a term to describe someone, just like the term transgender or the term, non-binary. So very, very interesting to kind of see. And that died down really quick, right? Is kind of creating that false victimhood. And yeah, so we haven't seen really any discussion on that after the couple weeks that was kind of on fire. But how we see cisnormativity in advocacy is, again, blaming the assault abuse on identity, even like disregarding the victim and saying things like, well, if you weren't so ... right? Saying to folks like, oh, we can't help you, ignoring them, being told, oh, we don't have the funding, right? When honey, tell me in what grant and where in that grant it says that you cannot specifically serve transgender or gender nonconforming folks. Just tell me. Just show me what line, right? Those, especially the federal grants, have very large, very hefty non-discrimination provisions. So homophobia and biphobia. So homophobia and biphobia and transphobia, we're gonna break these down a little bit differently. So there's two aspects to these definitions that I want to go over. The first part is the actual definition, and the second part I want to address fear. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation in just a second about fear. So get your chat boxes ready. So homophobia, biphobia. So this is the irrational fear that anything that does not conform to rigid stereotypes for relationships and attraction, right? So relationships and attraction, homophobia, biphobia, right? So think about how this plays out. Again, refusal to serve people. We do see a lot of blaming, denying, services, and then also using the term lifestyle to describe someone. So we have these like slights, these microaggressions that folks are using when survivors are coming in for services, right? Lifestyle is, how you do something. It's not part of your identity, right? Like we're going to talk a little bit more about this in the next section, in our last section. But yeah, this is a part of someone's very identity, right? Grab a little water. Excuse me. So transphobia, again, this is the irrational fear of anything that does not conform to rigid sex and gender role stereotypes. So are you seeing the difference here? Homophobia, transphobia, or excuse me, homophobia, biphobia, relationships and traction, transphobia, gender roles, and sex stereotypes, right? So, I mean, again, not believing a survivor's identity is real, right? Especially their gender identity, saying it's just a phase, that they need to act quote unquote right or dress quote unquote appropriately. Imagine being a victim or survivor, someone who's just brutalized, someone who's just sexually assaulted or had been sexually assaulted in their past. And for someone who is supposed to support you and care for you, for them to dig into you, invalidate you, insult you instead of supporting you. Would you ever engage in services again? Like for example, transgender folks, lesbians, bisexual women are less likely to get preventative services at the doctor, right? Because of those barriers. It took me years, almost 5 years, to come out to my general practitioner. I was so nervous that it was already a contentious relationship. I already hated going there. And I was just like, this is just going to make it worse. Like, I did finally tell her, and it completely changed our relationship. Completely. Like, instead of her being kind of standoffish with me, when I would come in, she would say, I'm really glad you're here. I'm, really glad to see you, right? It was huge. It was huge. Like I had a really positive experience, but that fear alone can stop someone from getting services, right? Like, we don't want to become a statistic, but many of us will because the barriers are so high, right? So yeah, I mean, keep that in mind, especially when we talk about like the bathroom, the anti-trans bathroom argument is a big example of transphobia. So think about the fact that we are literally justifying taking away the rights of people, of an entire group of people, because someone is worried that something may happen. If we're worried that something may happen, honey, let's fund prevention work. Because, girl, we know that's incredibly beneficial and we can actually help prevent violence, right? But anti-trans bathroom laws, we're assuming that transgender people are inherently dangerous and that we leave our houses in the morning to perpetrate violence upon people, right? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. I am significantly more worried about someone perpetrating violence upon me. Significantly more worried, right? Even when I go to the store. Is someone at the grocery store going to make another stupid comment? Are they going to say another thing that's just going to, send me, right? I'm like, these are the things that I'm worrying about. I'm worried about being safe traveling for work. I'm worried about being safe going to the bathroom, right? I'm not thinking about perpetrating violence upon people. I'm thinking about just making it through the day, making it home, right? And especially for, again, remember that transgender folks are significantly more likely to be victims of crime, especially homicide and sexual violence, than they are to perpetrate it. So why are we blaming the victims? Why? We literally have statistics. We literally have information. Why are we making this up as we go? And why are we believing it? Why are we believing it? Okay. I mean, studies, show that folks who have a friendship or a personal connection to someone who is Two-Spirit or LGBTQIA plus have a more positive view of the community, right? Why? Because you humanize the community. It's wild to think about it, but my job for the last 10 years is to be the face of the community, is to humanize my community. You know that intro slide that I had at the beginning of the presentation? It's there for a reason, right? Like, yeah, I like to show you how nerdy I am, for sure. Look at this picture of cardboard that I glued together and look how cool it looks now, right? It's not a Best Buy box anymore. But that's a way for me to connect with you so that you can see that I'm similar to you, that I too have cute little kitties that I just want to give little smooches to, and that I have fun, silly little hobbies, and that I'm a silly goose, right? But that is a tool that I use to humanize myself. Isn't that wild? That is strictly for humanization, right? And yeah, imagine like the burden that that places on folks, that folks that work in the field, and especially victims and survivors, right? Is that, are we forcing victims and survivors to humanize themselves before they receive services? Do they have to prove to us that they're human before we can help them? It's wild. It's wild. I want you to think about that. I want you to think about that. Okay. So let's talk about this last piece here, and then we'll go on to the next section. Okay. You notice that in both of these definitions, the words irrational fear are included, right? And you're probably like, well, gosh and heck, I wouldn't say that I'm afraid of gay people, right? Think about this. How many times have you heard someone respond to this, like, irrational fear, what are you talking about? I'm not afraid of gay people. I just don't want them to teach my kids. I'm not afraid of gay people. I just don't want them to get married. I'm not afraid of gay people. I just don't want to have to see them on TV. I don't want them to, quote unquote, force it down our throats, right? By them existing in the 5% of queer characters across all movies and all TV shows in the last 10 years, right? Think about when we talk about transphobia. I'm not afraid of trans people. I just don't want them to use the bathroom in public places. I'm not afraid of trans people. I just don't want transgender children to participate in after-school activities. I'm not afraid of transgender children. I just don't want them to participate in any sports. Think about that for a second. Think about that. Right? Think about how fear has been something that's been highly beneficial to humans for survival, right? My ancestors saw a Sasquatch and they were like, you know what, gosh and heck, I'm definitely just going to turn the other way and let Sassy kind of like chill and do their own thing. I'm not going to engage and like try and be best friends with this huge creature, right? Thank you for that. Thank you for not trying to be best friends with the mountain lion, right? But today, our mammalian brain, right, our higher cognitive functioning, our problem solving, our ability to grasp complex thoughts and reasoning and concepts, combined with our reptilian brain, our fight, flight, freeze, sometimes our brain can come up with these irrational fears, right? Why should we be afraid of gay people teaching our children? Why should we be afraid of someone teaching our kids geometry, right? If that teacher can teach our kids how to do geometry, praise, like, thank you, right? Because I ain't the one who's going to be doing it, right? Yeah, think about that. Like, it's just it's wild to me, right? Is this complex brain that we have comes with benefits and also some downsides, right? Is that in many ways we create these folk devils, right? These scary others who are who we need to protect ourselves and our children from, right? Yeah, very interesting. Very interesting how fear has such a huge place in a lot of this, right? So our last section, gosh, we're almost done. And I'm gonna have me some lunch. So the importance of language. So we're gonna talk about language, the importance of language. So the first one is free speech. I'm sure a lot of you have heard the free speech argument. Well, you can't censor me and tell me what to say and what to not say. I have free speech, so on and so forth. For sure, for sure, for sure. You got free speech, right? So first off, censorship is defined as the government telling you what you can and can't say, right? Honey, I'm not the government. I work at a little nonprofit. I got me some cats and I play games, right? I'm not the government. What I'm doing here is giving you information, research, best practices, promising practices on how to improve your advocacy and provide trauma-informed care, right? If you walk into a room and start spouting hate speech, slurs, other terrible things, and someone else in that room says, gosh and heck, I sure don't like what you're saying. Can you please stop? Honey, that's not censorship. Those are called consequences. Okay. You put your hand on the hot stove and you got burned, right? So remember that if you have free speech, everyone else in that room has free speech too. And that means that they can tell you to shush, right? They can say shush. So if you're making the active choice to perpetrate violence upon someone else and someone else is not okay with it and they say, hey, please stop, that's not censorship, okay? Keep that in mind. And also think about, why am I using this language? Why am I perpetrating this violence upon others? Why am I perpetuating ideas that are false, I know are false, and that are hurtful to other people, right? So my job, my goal in advocacy is to provide services, resources, support, and destroy barriers for survivors, right? I want to make the world a better place for the next generation. All the sacrifices I went through are not just to hopefully make my life a little bit better, but I want the next generation, I want Gen Z, I think it's Alpha generation is the next one. I want them to not struggle with the discrimination, oppression, and terrible things that I had to deal with. I want them to have an easier and better time, right? That's my goal. My goal is to make the world better than how I started, how I started. So hopefully you'll join me on that. Hopefully you'll join me on that, right? And so the next dot point is meaningful. Language is meaningful and meaningless, right? What this means is it's meaningful in the way that language gives us words, descriptors, adjectives to describe our lived experience, to find other people with shared experiences and identities, to find community, right? Like, I will tell you that, oftentimes being someone who's two-spirit LGBTQIA plus, it can be an incredibly lonely experience, right? Is that not only finding people who are part of the community, but if we can't find people, within our community, that finding people who are not going to perpetrate harm upon us, right? People who are going to care about us. That's scary. That's scary, especially for many of us. We've experienced rejection throughout our life. And so it can be really, really hard trusting and finding, folks who are caring about us. And so that language, having that language to connect with other people can be so great, so great. It's meaningless in that each person experiences their identity differently. And depending on your region, culture, community, and society, that all these words can mean something different, right? So if you come to Utah and you're like, hey, where's the LGBTQ center? And they're like, oh yeah, it's the Pride Center. But if you say, like where's the like the gay area or the gay center, and people are like, wait, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the bar scene? Are you talking about, right? Depending on where you're at, it could mean, a resource center. It could mean a bar. It could mean a community center. It could mean a informal meetup group. It could mean so many different things, right? And so just keep that in mind, that if you know some language here, that if you go to California, it's probably going to be a little bit different, right? And it's really important to meet that person where they're at and have a conversation with them, connect with them person to person, right? Is that this person will tell you who they are, right? And during your conversation, you're going to ask them questions and find out more about them, and that's going to help you within your advocacy, right? And then the last one on this slide is mirroring language. So if someone says that they're bisexual, you're going to use those terms bisexual. You're not going to use the term gay. Being bisexual and being gay are two very different experiences, and come with a different bag of nuances and potential ways of being discriminated against and rejection. So mirror that person's language. Like, think about if you're working with, like, say, a 60-year-old lesbian, there is probably no way that you're going to use the word queer to identify them. Absolutely not. We're going to talk about that here on the next slide, actually, is the term queer. I mean, this term has been used to hurt, to victimize people for decades and decades and decades. And is that some people avoid this term because there's so much historical trauma associated with it, right? Even though this term has been taken back, in the 80s. And me as a millennial, I have found empowerment by using this term, because I have taken it back and said that you cannot victimize me by using this term, because this is what I am. And I love that about me, right? It's not something that I see as a deficiency. And it's really important too, that say that 6-year-old lesbian versus me, is that person has experienced this word differently than I have. Not saying that I, haven't necessarily, experienced the discrimination and backlash from that, but our experiences are different, right? And I was born in the era where it was taken back, and I have been able to see that as a positive word, right? So keep that in mind, is that's why we really want to mirror language, is because we don't want to unintentionally re-victimize someone, right? So the next one in these lists of problematic terms is homosexual, right? Why this can be problematic is that it prioritizes, or what's the word? Oh, I'm going to use the word prioritize because I can't think of the other word right now. Someone's sexuality, their sexual, what's the word? Activities, right? So it puts a spotlight on that it's assuming that all people who are homosexual are just super sexually active, and that sex is just the number one part of it, right? It also has these negative, mental health, mental illness. It pathologizes people, right? I mean, homosexuality was in the DSM for a number of years. And think about the stigmas we have on homosexuality and combine those with the stigmas that we have on mental illness, like that's enormous. That's, creates a multiple or a double stigma, right? And that just makes it even more difficult. So it pathologizes, it focuses on sex. I mean, think about when you hear someone says, oh, I'm, homosexual, that the first thing you think of is like, oh, this person has sex with other men, right? When there's so much more to this person, like they can paint, they can do 10 backflips, they make their own tea, whatever, right? So just keep in mind that people are multifaceted and identity beings, and that we're not just this single dimension entities, The next one is lifestyle. So this assumes that people do things a certain way because of their identity. So, I mean, maybe I live the gay lifestyle, right? This morning I gay woke up to my gay iPhone gay alarm. My gay cats were gay mad because they wanted to be gay fed. So I gay got up, I gay took my medicine, I gay fed the cats. I gay made some gay oatmeal with some peanut butter, some flax seeds, some gay chia seeds, and some gay cranberries. So good. And then I gay logged on to my gay computer and started this, gay webinar, right? Like, obviously that's ridiculous. First, that I didn't wake up to that alarm. There ain't no way. Secondly, I got out of bed because Bolin was scream meowing like he does every morning. And mad cats they're just not great to be around. But, I got up, I did my stuff, I made my oatmeal, I sat in my office chair, kind of zoning out for a minute, and then I went to work, right? So yeah, like sometimes I forget to brush my teeth. Sometimes I'm lazy and don't do my dishes, right? Does that mean I do those things because I'm gay? No. It's because sometimes I just want to lay down after, I had a long day at work, right? And I don't want to do the dishes and I'm not getting out of bed. So my teeth are going to be a little stink town, right, for that day. Yeah, so hopefully that helps. But the last one here is same-sex attracted, or SSA. So it's really important to preface this with that cultural competency, right? That cultural humility is that if someone comes in and says, hey, I'm living with same-sex attraction, I'm I'm struggling with SSA, is that we're not pulling up a BuzzFeed article of the top 101 sexual orientations and say, sorry, honey, but it says here that you are gay. We're not doing that. We're definitely not doing that. What we're doing is we're meeting that person where they're at and we're supporting them the best way we can, right? And so if that person identifies with that terminology, that's valid and that's real, right? So there's some cultural nuances, right, and significance with that term, and that language best describes or identifies that person, and then they feel the most comfortable with, right? That can change, but keep that in mind, that we're never here to tell someone that that their identity is invalid or that's not the quote unquote right terms. They can use whatever dang term they want to use, right? How this can be problematic is oftentimes in print because it says it's struggling with same-sex attraction. It's saying that there's something inherently wrong with that, it can be changed. And, real talk, you can't change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Conversion therapy, reparative therapy, these things are harmful. All the major medical associations, including the Psychological Association, has denounced and released statements. They've been out for years and years and years on how harmful reparative therapy and conversion therapy is, and how it is simply impossible to change someone's sexual orientation or gender identity. I don't know if any of you remember this, but remember in the 90s, it was all over like Time magazine, the ex-gay movement. Remember that? It happens about every like 10, 15 years. We get another ex-gay movement and this conversion therapy conversation kind of comes up. But all those people in the ex-gay movement, well, they're gay, right? They're not ex-gay anymore. I think there's even a documentary on Netflix now that talks about some of the movement, and like it's incredibly hard to watch because some of the things that people go through is really just devastating to watch, and I couldn't even imagine going through some of those programs that people are go through. But yeah, yeah, gosh, there's a lot of people's stories out there now, and it can be really hard to hear. So the next one, this is our second to last page here, or slide. Preference. So the term preference. Sometimes you hear this when folks say, "Oh, what are your preferred pronouns?" I suggest avoiding using the term preferred, because it leaves too much room for a margin of error. So it's saying, "Oh, it's a preference, so I don't have to honor them. I can still use your old pronouns," right? When being misgendered is a form of violence upon the transgender and non-binary community, is that people use misgendering specifically to perpetrate violence against trans people, right? Is that this is a target, this is a weapon that's essentially used, right? And especially if people are not open about their transgender identity and maybe are stealth, you know, not really sharing with every single person that they meet that they are transgender, because of the excuse me, potential danger of that, is that absolutely can increase someone's danger, right? Is that if, again, they're outed, you know, if they're outed, that person may be at risk for victimization, right? Up to and including homicide. Ask, you know, someone, you know, what pronouns do you use? I like to start meetings, and when I do introductions, invite people to share their pronouns, right? I do not ever force anyone to share their pronouns, ever. I will invite someone to share their pronouns if they would like, absolutely, right? But people should not, you know, be forced to do that, right? And again, we talk about someone may not be out, it may be uncomfortable for them to, you know, share pronouns that they're not comfortable with, but know that they have to because of safety. Or some people, they just don't want to share their pronouns, and that's fine. That's fine. So you can ask someone, you know, what pronouns do you use? I know when I introduce myself, I say, you know, my name is Andy Tremonti, and I use they, them, their pronouns, right? And that is a little invitation for someone to say, oh, my name is Bolin, and I use he, him pronouns, you know? You don't have to overcomplicate it. Remember that if you feel a little bit like iffy or a little bit nervous right now, that the more you do it, the more you practice, the better you're going to be at it, right? So remember that we all grew up in this binary system of gender, and things are evolving. Things are opening up. People are able to do more things and really step out of these boxes that we've been forced into all of our lives. And that means that there's going to be some uncomfortable feelings, right? Is because we are stepping out of a box, a box that we've only known the walls of our entire life. And now we're seeing that there are walls that have different patterns, different colors. There are trees, there's grass, there's rivers and lakes, and that can be scary. So be kind to yourself. Mistakes are going to happen. I make mistakes, right? Turns out I'm not perfect, although I'd like to believe I am. You know, turns out I'm not perfect, and I make mistakes, but do you know what I do? I correct myself and move on. I say, oops, she went to the store, and then I move on. I do not make a federal case out of it, right? I do not say, oh, I'm so sorry, I messed up, I should have known. I'm so stupid for forgetting, like, why can't I get this right? I am not creating victimhood. I'm not becoming the victim in this, right? Is that people make mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes. It sucks, right? And what happens is what we do after those mistakes, right? Is that, oh, excuse me, we correct ourselves and then we move on, right? If it happens multiple times, then that's when it kind of becomes more of an issue, but mistakes are going to happen. Okay, mistakes are going to happen. Be gentle with yourself and practice, practice, practice. Practice makes perfect, right? When you're thinking about someone, think about them with their new pronouns or the pronouns that they shared with you, right? have a conversation with them about, should I use these pronouns just in our office or should I use them outside? Should I correct people when they use inappropriate or the wrong pronouns, and how should I correct them? I actually have a pretty awesome group of friends, and I love that one of the things they do is they use gentle corrections, and then they kind of, go up the ladder in their response hierarchy when people are not using the correct pronouns. And I love that. I love that that my group of friends always has my back, and that they are there first and foremost, and if anything is happening to me, that they're supporting, right? So I love that. I love that. But think about when someone's sharing their pronouns with you and their name and stuff, is that is such a huge honor, right? That someone trusts you enough that you're not going to re-victimize them, or you're not going to misgender them to perpetrate violence against them. I think that's huge. That's huge. When people come out to me and people share their life experiences and their pronouns and stuff to me, that feels so special to me. I feel like I did something right to where they felt comfortable talking to me. That feels so good to me. I love it. I love it. And so, yeah, think of it as a very positive thing, is that you've created a space where someone feels comfortable with you. I think that's great. I think that's great. Last slide. Last slide. We made it through. We made it through. So the first term here is transgendered with an ED, right? Being a transgender person, it's not something that happened to you. It's not an action. It's not a verb. You didn't go to the gym and come back transgendered, right? Remember that transgender people are in fact people. So use people first language. A person who is transgender, a transgender person. The next one is transgenders with an S. Remember that transgender people, again, are people. They're not, we're not objects, right? So you would never say, look at that wild pack of transgenders over there, right? Again, people first language, a person who's transgender, a transgender person, or just, I'm going out on a limb here, right? Use their name. What? Transgender people have names? Whoa, the more you know, right? I have a friend who I've presented with, gosh, I can't even tell you how many times, but she kind of was a little struggle goose with the they, them, their pronouns. And so she would just use my name. Guess what? Worked out perfect, was fine, was great. Go for it, right? Yeah, so the next one, transsexual. This is an out-of-date medical term used to describe someone who's had medical intervention. So like hormone replacement surgery, they used to call it sex reassignment surgery. And now we generally refer to it as like gender affirming care, or part of gender affirming care, because there's a lot that goes into gender affirming care. So keep in mind that, again, language evolves. People take back language that has been hurtful and problematic in the past. So we are starting to see, or you'll notice too, in older transgender populations and folks, that they may still use the term transsexual because that's the term that was used when they were younger. That's the term that they're most familiar with and maybe most comfortable with. So again, we're not going to correct people if that's the terms they use. That's the terms they use, right? The next one, tranny, he, she, male. These are all slurs. Please avoid them. Yeah, these are all slurs. Tranny is probably the biggest slur, the one that I've seen used the most. Like I can't even tell you how many times I've been called that. But also, these are a very popular genre of pornography. So it's really quite interesting to see, especially, in different areas across the United States, the most popular genres of pornography. And you'll notice that people are engaging in viewing pornography of groups that have the least power and are the most marginalized within that community. It's super interesting to see that people are okay with objectifying and sexualizing marginalized communities, but not okay with folks having rights, basic rights. And I think that's really telling of, kind of the state that we're in, right? And then the last one is transvestite. So this has many different meanings. So sometimes you'll see this term be used also with crossdresser. So that term has also made a little bit of a comeback. So transvestite, can mean, a heterosexual man wearing women's clothing, right? It can also mean someone wearing, like a man wearing, for example, wearing women's clothing for sexual gratification. We're starting to see, especially a lot of drag queens take back this term. And so you'll see drag queens refer to them as like transvestites. And so that's that reclamation. They're reclaiming that word as this is my word. You do not get to use it against me, right? So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. Mirror language, but also, be sensitive and aware that there are a lot of problematic terms. And so using some language can maybe make your belly kind of a little bit, uncertain, or you can even experience some re-victimization yourself. So have those conversations, talk to yourself, delve into, some of the things that you're noticing that maybe you're feeling a little bit uncomfortable with, and have some conversations, because it can be really good to talk about that and figure it out, right?